Sarai was born in a rich land full of strange gods. Ur of the Chaldeans was bustling with noisy markets, strong smells of spices in the air, and tall temples everywhere. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to have a destiny already written, except her. Sarai was beautiful and intelligent, but she carried an emptiness that even she couldn't explain. And even though she was with Abraham, a man of integrity and determination, something seemed incomplete. She had no children. And in those days, not being a mother was almost like being invisible. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. Her life could have followed its usual course if it weren't for a voice, a divine command that was not spoken to her, but to her husband. Leave your country, your family, and go to the land I will show you. That's all. No map, no clear destination, just faith. And Abraham, without arguing, decided to obey. And Sarai, she went with him, without making a fuss, without asking too many questions. She gathered her belongings, took one last look at the city she grew up in, and left. It wasn't a beautiful farewell. It was a break, a rupture between the comfort of the familiar and the mystery of what was to come. They walked as if following a promise that had no form yet, only a voice. And in the middle of the journey, with every step on the hot, dusty ground, Sarai began to understand that her life was about to be rewritten, not with the letters of tradition, but with the strokes of a plan much greater than herself. Sarai walked side by side with Abraham through lands she did not know, surrounded by landscapes that were sometimes enchanting, sometimes frightening. But amid the silence of the nights and the noise of the winds in the desert, a promise emerged. It was not whispered in a dream, nor found in some hidden sign. It was God who spoke, directly to Abram. He promised something that seemed too big, that he would make him a great nation, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Sarai heard it, not from the mouth of God, but from the lips of her husband, full of faith and with shining eyes. But a twinge in her chest insisted on hurting. How could she build a nation if she couldn't even bear a child? The promise seemed like a beautiful story written on parchment, but in a language she didn't yet understand. Time began to pass. A month, 2 years. Sarai's hair turned whiter, her hands more wrinkled, and her womb. It remained silent. With each new moon, hope diminished a little. With each pregnancy of a neighbor, a new tightness in her ribs. And yet Abraham believed. He continued to talk about the promise as if it had already been fulfilled. It was beautiful to see and hard to bear. Sarai did not complain out loud. She kept everything inside, like someone who hides a cracked vase on the shelf and pretends it is whole. Sometimes, when no one was looking, she would look up at the sky and try to count the stars, just to remember what had been said. But the numbers never added up, and neither did her faith. And it was in this rhythm of high promises and low hopes that the journey to Egypt came about, a path forced by hunger, an unexpected detour, and with it, a decision by Abraham that would change everything and put Sarai at the center of a risky plan. The famine grew worse. It was impossible to ignore. The pastures dried up, the animals began to waste away, and the faces of the people were filled with worry. Abraham had no choice. He took his family to Egypt, where there was food. But as they approached the border, he looked at Sarai and saw what had always been there, beauty. Even with time marking her skin, she still attracted attention. And that, in Egypt, could be a serious problem. So Abram called her aside, his voice already tinged with guilt. He asked her to say she was his sister, a half-truth, since they were indeed related on their father's side. But it was a lie in intent. Abram was afraid of being killed because of her. And Sarai, she didn't question it. Once again, she remained silent. She swallowed her unease, adjusted her veil, and entered the city as a sister, not as a wife. It didn't take long. The eyes of the Egyptians noticed Sarai. She was taken to the Pharaoh's palace. Gifts began to arrive for Abram. Cattle, servants, silver, all in exchange for that woman who was now far from her husband's eyes and arms. Sarai was surrounded by silks and perfumes, but no luxury could erase the feeling of being in the wrong place. Something was weighing heavily in the air. She knew it, and so did God. Then the plagues began. At first they were subtle, then they became overwhelming. The palace was thrown into chaos. Pharaoh realized that there was something wrong with this woman who was so serene and yet so surrounded by disaster. When he discovered the truth, he was furious. He summoned Abraham, returned Sarai, and ordered them to leave, quickly. They left Egypt with more than they had brought: riches, servants, and a silent tension between what had been done and what was yet to come. Time passed, and passed, and passed some more. The years piled up like stones on a road that was too long. Sarah was no longer young, and God's promise remained in the same place, in the air. Isaac was still just an imagined name, and her womb remained silent as the desert on a windless day. That was when she looked at Hagar, the Egyptian, the servant they had brought from Egypt. She had youth in her face, strength in her arms, and a body capable of bearing children. Sarah thought, pondered, and decided. She called Abram, her voice firm with the weariness of one who is tired of waiting and at the same time trying to help the promise come true. She asked him to lie with Hagar. If she became pregnant, the child would be raised as their own. It was a common way of dealing with infertility at that time, but what seemed practical turned into a deep rift. Hagar conceived, and as her belly grew, so did her pride. Her gaze changed. She was no longer just a servant. She was the woman who gave the patriarch what his wife could never give him. And Sarah? She felt every glance piercing her like an arrow. The humiliation hit her hard. This was not what she had imagined. She asked Abram for help, demanding that he replace Hagar with her, and he, not knowing what to do, left the decision in Sarah's hands. The tension turned into a storm. Sarah treated Hagar harshly, and the servant, pregnant and wounded, fled to the desert. But there, alone and almost without strength, she was found by an angel, an encounter that would change the course of history, and the name of the child, Ishmael. God hears. Hagar returned, and the boy was born. Abraham now had a son, but Sarah had only silence and scars. But heaven had not yet finished its part. Because in the midst of that worn-out routine, something unexpected began to happen, and it came in the form of a visit on an ordinary day. The sun was beating down on that ordinary day. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of the tent trying to escape the heat when three men appeared out of nowhere. They didn't look like tired travelers or noisy merchants. There was something different about them. Abraham ran, offered water, food, rest. And Sarah, inside the tent, listened carefully, pretending to be busy, but not missing a word. While the bread was baking and the meat was being served, one of the visitors asked a simple question. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" He knew her name. He knew she was there. And before anyone could say another word, the same man spoke with firm calm. "In a year's time, I will return, and Sarah will have a son." Silence fell like a stone. Inside the tent, Sarah heard it and laughed. Not loudly, not openly. It was that muffled laugh, the kind that escapes when you've grown accustomed to not believing anymore. A short laugh, half bitter, half cynical, as if to say, "Really? Now?" She was almost 90 years old. She had given up hope, given up dreaming. She laughed, yes, not out of mockery, but out of exhaustion. And that's when the visitor spoke again. Why did Sarah laugh? The question pierced the canvas of the tent as if there were no walls. Sarah, startled, denied it. "I didn't laugh. But he looked toward the tent and replied, "Yes, you did." That hit her hard, not because she was angry, but because it was true. God had seen, he had heard, he had felt, and yet he had not gone back on his promise. At that same meeting, her name was changed from Sarai to Sara. New name, new identity. It was as if God was saying, "No matter how much you doubted, I will still fulfill what I promised." Her belly began to grow, slowly, as if to make sure it was real. Sara looked at herself in the mirror and ran her hand over her waist, trying to understand what was happening. Every bout of nausea, every movement in her body was like a whisper from God saying, "I told you it would happen." But even so, she sometimes found herself silent, frightened, trying not to believe too much. After all, what happens to a woman who waits her whole life for something, and one day it finally comes? She was 90 years old. No one at that time, not even in their wildest dreams, imagined a mother at that age. The other women whispered, the men looked astonished, but there she was, tired, wrinkled, laughing softly with one hand on her belly and the other pointing to the sky. The birth arrived, and with it the most anticipated cry of her life. Isaac was born, a healthy boy with rosy skin and lively eyes. When they placed him in her arms, Sara couldn't hold him. She burst into laughter. A light, clear laugh from someone who allowed herself to be happy after so long swallowing tears. And his name had already been decided, Isaac, which means he laughs, because the laughter that was once doubt turned into the sound of a promise fulfilled. People came to visit. Everyone wanted to see the miracle with their own eyes. And Sara, with the boy in her arms, said, "Who would have thought that I would still be nursing a child, that God would make me laugh like this?" It was as if time itself had stopped to watch that moment. But not all laughter is shared. Isaac grew up, and with him, the discomfort. Ishmael, Abraham's other son, was already a young man, and the relationship between the two began to generate sparks, glances, harsh words, disguised fights. Isaac was already walking, talking, running between the tents with that curious manner that only small children have. He was the son of promise, the boy God gave when no one else believed. But the shadow of the past still lingered. Ishmael, now a teenager, watched everything. The eldest son, born first but not the chosen one. And there, on that day of celebration when Isaac was weaned, something happened that Sara never forgot. Ishmael mocked him. A twisted, mocking laugh. Perhaps out of jealousy, perhaps out of rebellion, but for Sara it was like an arrow. It wasn't just a brother's teasing, it was a threat, a sign that the two could not grow up together. Two destinies colliding, two sons, two stories, and only one covenant. She didn't hesitate. She went straight to Abraham, her eyes full of determination. "Send this servant and her son away. The son of a slave will not share my inheritance." Abraham hesitated. He was the father of both children. He loved them both, but that choice was not his alone. And God spoke to him. He told him to listen to Sara, to do as she said, because it was through Isaac that the promise would continue. That morning, Abraham got up early, prepared bread and water, gave it to Hagar, and the two left. Ishmael left with his head full of questions. Hagar's heart was heavy, and Sara, watching from afar, knew she had done what was necessary, even if it was painful. Sara didn't know. She didn't know about the call Abraham received that morning. She didn't hear the voice asking for something unthinkable. All she saw was her husband getting up early, silently with a heavy face, and preparing the wood. He called Isaac, took 2 servants, and left, without explaining where they were going or why. She stayed, alone with the wind and the absence. Her heart, which had already learned to wait, now tried not to imagine. Meanwhile, high up on Mount Moriah, the boy asked, "Father, where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" And Abraham replied with the faith that Sara had always known in his eyes, "God will provide." Days later, the two returned. The same silence that had taken father and son now brought them back. But something was different. Isaac was quieter. Abram had a distant look in his eyes. Sarah sensed that something had happened up there, something they couldn't put into words. But despite the shadows, Sarah was light. Inside the camp, she was still the center. Matriarch, mother of the promise. She was the one the women sought when their children cried or their husbands were silent. She knew when to be quiet and when to speak the truth. Time had marked her face, but it had not erased her strength. And even though she no longer carried babies in her arms, Sara carried something even stronger, a living history. Her life was a testimony of faith that falters but does not give up, of promises that are slow in coming but never fail, and her name came to be remembered with respect. She no longer ran as she once did, nor did she see as clearly, but her spirit was as firm as a rock. And when the day came when her weary body could no longer hold on, everything stopped. The day dawned heavy. The wind blew more slowly, as if even nature knew that something had changed. Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, in Hebron, 127 years old. No other woman in Scripture had her age recorded like this. It was as if God wanted to make it clear. She was great. She was important. She lived everything she had to live. And then some. Abraham wept. He truly wept. The man who had faced kings and storms broke down there before the body of the woman who had walked with him since who laughed with him, who doubted with him, who believed with him. It wasn't just mourning. It was the weight of a lifetime shared. But even in death, Sarah paved the way. Abraham needed to bury her, and not just anywhere. He didn't want a borrowed grave or a favor from anyone. He wanted land, his own land, something that belonged to them. He went to the Hittites, spoke respectfully, and bought the cave of Machpelah next to the field of Ephron for full price in front of everyone. No haggling, no shortcuts. It was too important. There, in that simple cave, he buried Sarah. The first to be buried in the promised land, before the conquest, before possession, as if her body were an anchor cast into the future, as if God were saying, something is about to begin here. The land was still occupied by other peoples, but the heart of the promise was already planted there, in the form of mourning but also of certainty. And as the people returned to their tents and the silence of the cave settled, Abraham knew he still had things to do, because now Isaac was a man, and he needed a wife, someone who could continue the story that Sarah helped build, someone who, without knowing it, would inherit not only the blessing, but also the legacy of that woman. Abraham stayed longer in the land that promised to be his descendants. Sarah's absence was felt in every detail of his routine, the way she organized the tents, her insightful questions, her silences full of wisdom. But life, even though painful, went on. And now he had a clear mission: to find a wife for Isaac, someone who would not only continue the lineage, but who would carry the kind of faith that Sarah lived, even without understanding everything. He sent his trusted servant in search of this woman. He didn't want someone from the land of Canaan. He wanted her to come from his own family. And the servant went, prayed, observed, until he found Rebekah, a strong, determined young woman with eyes that also carried promise. When she arrived riding on a camel, Isaac saw her from afar, and something in him recognized her. She would be his. And in that union, something beautiful happened. The Bible says that Isaac took Rebekah to the tent of Sarah, his mother. And there he was, comforted, as if the tent, even empty, still carried the scent of the woman who had been mother, companion, root, and future. The years passed, but Sarah's name was never forgotten. On the contrary, it echoed in stories around campfires, in conversations between generations. She became a reference point, not only because she was the mother of the promise, but for everything she had experienced before that, for the time she waited, for the choices she made, for the times she doubted and yet continued on. Much later, the prophets would still speak of her. The letters of the apostles would call her an example. And every woman who faced silence, delay, or the pain of not seeing what God promised would remember Sarah. Sarah's story ends in the flesh, but it lives on in the spirit of everyone who has ever found themselves waiting for something that seemed impossible. She was a woman of faith, yes, but a faith that wavered, that cried in the dark, that laughed nervously, that tried to take matters into her own hands. And perhaps that is what makes her so close to us. Because Sarah's faith was not perfect, it was real. She wasn't born ready. She grew up with time, with mistakes, with God's silence between one promise and another. She doubted, yes. She made hasty choices, hurt people along the way. But even so, God didn't take away what He promised her. He didn't go back on His word. Because the promise never depended on her strength, but on His faithfulness. Sarah teaches us that not all waiting is punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes it is God stirring things up that we don't even know need to be stirred up. And that even when everything seems to be at a standstill, He is still doing something, deep down, where the eyes cannot see. She also shows us that you don't have to be center stage to be central to the story. Often, Abraham had the most important lines, but it was Sarah who carried the miracle in her womb. It was she who cried for years without an answer. And it was she who left a legacy of faith that spanned generations. In the end, Sarah is remembered not because she did everything right, but because she didn't give up, because she kept going, and because when she finally laughed with joy, she laughed like someone who knew the weight of the journey. So if you ever feel like it's too late, that nothing will change, or that God has forgotten you, remember Sarah. She thought it was too late, but God arrived at the right time, as He always does. If you liked Sarah's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.